Dean. Go ahead and share your desktop, introduce yourself, and the floor is yours, man.
Okay, thanks, Naveed. So hello, everybody. I'm Dean Cifola. I'm a senior fast track engineer, and we're part of the customer experience team on the Azure engineering side. And I've worked with Microsoft for just over 5 years. And one of the things I do on the side, not directly related to Microsoft, is I run the Azure Academy, which is a YouTube channel where we have a whole lot of Azure training videos. And here, I'll do a shameless plug. So youtube.com/Azure Academy, go check it out. A lot of topics around a lot of different issues, one of which we'll be talking about today, which is governance. And you can see all of the playlists that we have. So I want to limit this talk today to just governance, and I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to jump in, ask me questions about whatever it is that you're interested in, so we can make this as valuable for all of you as possible. So the topic today around governance, generally speaking, is approached generally two ways. First way, we have the compliance and regulatory side of governance, and that is certainly important, but that's only a fraction of what we would actually be encompassing in Azure governance. The rest of it is basically how we set up and manage Azure, and that's what I want to spend the majority of the time on. So we're going to cover these basic areas as much as we can and as much as we have time for. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. So let me go over to the Azure Portal. And basically, this is the end state that I want to suggest that you get to. And this is where you have a series of resource groups. You have a hierarchy set up. You've got your permissions set up, monitoring, security, policy, all in place to have your guardrails for your environment so that you can be as planned, safe as possible. Obviously, the human factor here comes into play. People can always do things that you didn't anticipate, but as much as possible, we want to get things to where they are as set up and managed as we can. So how do we get to an end state? Well, first thing we have to do is kind of start from the beginning. So here's a different Azure subscription that I have access to, and basically this is just a somewhat blank environment. I've got a couple resources in here, but not much. And when you're starting with Azure Governance, inside the Azure Portal, there is a tool that can really help you. And we'll search for that at the top here. This is the Azure Quick Start Center. And the Quick Start Center, if you're not familiar with it, basically is a bunch of guides, and this is all based on our documentation around the cloud adoption framework, and we'll talk about that in a second, as well as places to help you get started provisioning resources. So the governance section here is the Azure Setup Guide. Migration related topics is the migration guide, and innovation is where we move from IaaS to PaaS and we do modernization. So we'll go into the setup guide. And this is an overview of what the Quick Start Center setup guide is about and a link to the cloud adoption framework. So the framework here basically is a strategy for getting to the cloud from where you are. And it's not just related to Azure directly, although that's the direct implication, but it's for any kind of strategy. So first, I have to understand what it is that you want to accomplish. That's your defining strategy. Come up with a plan to accomplish that strategy, and then we prepare. And this is where the migration governance, foundation stuff comes into play. And then once you have that, you've got your plan to migrate into the cloud, innovate into the cloud, and then underneath all of that is governance and management. So in step number 2 here in the Quick Start Center, talks about setting up our Azure hierarchy. So Azure is managed from the management group to the subscription to the resource group down to the resource. And this is a waterfall type hierarchy. So whatever it is that you apply at the higher level impacts the lower level resources. So when we get into something like permissions, in the next slide here, this becomes very, very critical. So owners have the right to basically do anything that they want. So we want to limit the owners that we have at the higher levels so that they don't have too much control, but still have enough to be able to manage the cloud. For example, you have your IT department. IT probably needs to be owners at the management group level. The guy who's running the application in the accounting department should not be an owner. He at most needs to be a contributor inside a resource group so that he can provision and do whatever he has to for his resources, generally speaking. So we want to limit owner access across the hierarchy, make people at most contributor, or then we get into the area of customized permissions. So, and there's a somewhat philosophical divide on customized permissions. Some people really, really love it. I personally do not, because I have seen companies spend thousands of hours trying to get it right. And once they do, we change something and then it breaks everything. So if you need custom permissions, I generally recommend that you take our default permission groups and combine them together into a permission role for your customers. But then if you're already doing that, why wouldn't you just give somebody VM contributor and network reader? So I don't really like using custom permissions, but like I said, there's a kind of divide on that. So once we have our hierarchy planned and set up, then we have to think about all of our resources. And this gets into naming standards. And there's guides here around different naming conventions because everything in the cloud has to have a name. And then minimize this. And then with everything having a name, it's things that people haven't had to think about, like availability sets and naming my network cards and my routing tables. So we have suggestions out here for all of that stuff. And then, of course, the thing after that is, well, if I name a resource something, like I'm going to name it East US Virtual Network Routing Table. What happens if I have to move that resource? Now my naming convention is bad because the resource isn't in East US anymore. Now it's in West US. So the suggestion is that the naming of your resources shouldn't be very particular, meaning that we don't want to treat things in the cloud like our pets. We don't want to give them fancy little names, and we don't want to be able to hug them and say, you know, this is my Zeus server and this is my Olympus network. We should be treating these things like they're cattle. They should be disposable. They should be generic in their name, obviously following a naming standard, but it shouldn't be very particular to a region, to a functionality, because these things can move. Where we can add that additional information to still keep track of them is in tags. And there's a good example of a tag down here of a department being central IT, or location could be East US, application could be private link, environment could be dev, cost center can be whatever your cost center codes happen to be. So the idea of tags is that they're just metadata that we can attach to resources, and these pieces of metadata can change. So if we move resources around, we can update the tags without having to change the names of resources, which is generally not possible in Azure. So we've covered some of our permission stuff already, so I'll skip past that. And then we get to the idea of cost management. So in the cloud, obviously, we're building and provisioning resources. And while there are many things in Azure that are free, resources generally cost something. So we need to be able to understand that cost, break that cost down, and be able to do our chargeback or showback to the different companies or customers that we have internally. And so cost management gets into all of that stuff. And in every part of this Quick Start Center, there's action buttons down here to take you to those sections in Azure and be able to execute on what it is that you were learning about in the Quick Start Center. So this goes into my cost center for this particular subscription. I don't have a whole lot in here, so there's not a lot of data. Going back to here, and then we come to step number 5. And again, stop me if there's any questions. But step number 5 is where we actually get into the real meat of governance, and this is how we're going to implement everything. So that cloud adoption framework, we've done our strategy, we've done our planning, now we're ready to start implementing. And this is where we get into things like Azure Blueprints, which I'll go into in a second, and then Azure policies, monitoring, security, etc. So blueprints are a way to establish what you want through code and then be able to deploy it over and over again. So how is a blueprint different than a template? So a blueprint, if we go to the blueprint section here, and we go to create. So we've got a bunch of different sample blueprints, and some of these are around regulatory compliance, and others are around deploying environments. There is 2 blueprints in particular that I'm going to focus on, and these are the Cloud Adoption Framework blueprints for the foundation. This is governance, and then building migration landing zones. So, and I actually wrote both of these and got them posted up here in the sample. So they're in all of your subscriptions right now. So go check them out. And in the foundation, if we click on this, so we have to give a blueprint a name, and then put it into a location. I'll just store it in a management group and then hit next. And blueprints have artifacts. And artifacts are, if we click on the Add Artifacts button, they are policies, roles, templates, or resource groups. So whereas a ARM template will be able to deploy whatever you want in that template, and it can actually deploy resource groups now, in case you weren't aware of that. Blueprints take it a step higher, and it's now I've defined all of my templates together with my resource groups, roles, and permissions, so that I can now say this is my environment. And as my environment, I want deployed XYZ, and I want it deployed every time I deploy my stuff. So think about this in setting up a new subscription. Okay, something else that's very nice about blueprints is adding and removing things is ridiculously simple. So if I add an artifact to my network group here, and I'll add a policy assignment, and I'll just pick this one and hit add, now that policy is added. And just as easily, if I don't want something that's here, I can just remove it. So they're very easy to manipulate in the portal, and there is also a way to do this as pure code, and it's all JSON. It's a little bit different than ARM code today, but there's updates coming down the road soon where that's going to kind of become more ARM template-like. Now, once we have our blueprint as a draft and we've got everything the way that we want it, we've got to save this. And then we'll find that under our blueprint definitions, where then we've got to publish this blueprint in order for it to be usable in our environment. And when you publish it, we need some kind of version, and we'll call this Azure Power Lunch. And then we publish it. And now this blueprint is ready to assign. So I could hit the assign button, and now I just fill out all of my parameters throughout this blueprint. So I'll deploy it to this subscription, and I'll leave the name here as assignment foundation, deploy this into the East US. And then because blueprints have versions, we can deploy any one of the versions that we have in this blueprint. And then there are locks, and this is one of the other cool things about blueprints over ARM templates. When you deploy an ARM template, you can deploy resource locks, and that is something I do as part of this. But a blueprint lock is a little bit different. It is run through a managed ID in the cloud, which can either be system assigned or user assigned managed ID. And then once you've deployed this blueprint, you can deploy it as a do not delete or a read only. So just like a normal Azure lock, but the lock is controlled by the blueprint. So once this is in place with, for example, a read only, not even the subscription owner can do anything about it. It is fixed in place. The only way to edit anything is then through blueprints. So think about this in a managed environment. We've deployed this environment, it's certified, everything is here, nothing should ever be moved, set a read-only lock, and nothing can be changed outside of the blueprint. So then we need to give the blueprint here an organizational name, and this is to keep all of our resources unique. So I'll just call it Power Lunch, and then we can decide where we're going to deploy our Azure resources. Now this is different from where we're doing the location up here. This is where the blueprint is going to be assigned. This is where we're provisioning resources in the cloud, which I'll just leave in East US. But then I've also added here the ability to determine what Azure regions you want to allow in your environment. So part of governance controls is we say we have decided we're provisioning resources in the US. So I'll go ahead and check these resources for the US regions. But I don't want anybody deploying into Australia. So because I haven't selected them, those resources will be blocked from those locations. You can't deploy resources, you can't deploy resource groups outside of the regions I just checked. Then we have some things around our SKUs. So this is controlling costs. So storage accounts, obviously you can go into some pretty heavy costs in premium. So I just want to use standard or RAGS or ZRS for my SKUs of storage accounts. And then you have the choice of what VM SKUs you want to deploy. So I've only got a couple of them selected here, but you could select more. And the beauty of this, again, is that if someone tries to deploy a D1 V2, I haven't permitted that, so it would be blocked by policy. And then we have here our cost center tag that we want to assign to all of these resources. So that could be anything. So I'll just say Power Lunch 0. Yeah, it's good. And let's see. Then I've also added a section here to set up any particular kind of resources that you want to deny the ability to deploy. So this is again around controlling cost, but a little more than that. It's also around what we've decided to allow. So you could do something like, let's see, storage, and I could say don't deploy queues, or don't deploy, let's see, what's another good one? Don't deploy the Azure Sync service. Okay, so you could basically decide on anything you want. Every resource type is listed in here. And then what I'm also setting up here is a key vault. So in order to do that, we need permissions. So key vaults require somebody to have permissions in them, and you can pick their object ID. Oh, there we go. Is ever on? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, you select their object ID from Azure Active Directory. This could be a group or a user, and then put whatever you want for that in the field. And then setting up also monitoring. So log analytics is a part of this because that's where your diagnostic settings are going to be stored for all your resources. And I've set some values here for how long we're going to retain that data inside log analytics, and then what region we're going to deploy it to. Obviously, if you select a region that you have not permitted up top, this is going to fail. So select a region that you're obviously decided to work in. And then once you're done with all of that, you hit the assign button, and then that will deploy everything in about 5 to 10 minutes. And when you're done, you end up with basically this. And it deploys these resource groups, and within these resource groups you get certain resources, and then also Azure policies. And then after you deploy the foundation, then I also generally suggest that you deploy the migration landing zone, which will provision your networks as well as all of the resources necessary for Azure Migrate. And open Azure Migrate here. So all of the server assessment and migration tools, database assessment and migration tools, and then adding more over time. And then the other thing that we said we're implementing is Azure Policy. So in Policy, I'll go to the assignments. And so basically we're deploying over 100 policies through that blueprint to control how the environment is set up and governed through the settings that you just saw. So with a few clicks, you have now deployed a basic governance foundation across your entire environment. Now, on top of this, we're also setting up Azure Security Center Standard because standard is required for some of the other governance policies, specifically things like just-in-time VM access, and file integrity monitoring, adaptive controls, and all of that stuff. And that doing that blueprint will also improve your security hygiene scores and your policy compliance. And then because you've deployed those blueprints, you're also going to be mostly compliant with regulatory compliance across CIS, PCI, and ISO, which is taking a little long to load. But additionally, if you wanted to specifically be compliant with one of those, you can go to Blueprints and wait for it. I know the suspense is killing me. Refresh.
Always takes time, man.
Come on, you can do it. Oh man, you're ruining my thunder. Come on, Azure. There we go. Okay, so then we've also got the CIS benchmarks here as a blueprint that you can deploy on top of all of these things. And every one of the samples here are made to all be deployed on top of each other. So you can deploy CIS, you can deploy FedRAMP High, FedRAMP Moderate if you're in the Gov space, ISO, IRS, NIST, PCI, SWIFT, or some stuff here if you're in the UK. And if you have suggestions for other blueprints, please reach out and let me know, and then I can get that feedback to the product groups and we can start working on that stuff. But going back to the Quick Start Center, we've talked about Blueprints, which has applied for us Azure Policy, the Security Center, and also stuff around Azure Monitor, which is log analytics and diagnostic settings. And then we also go into some other details here about Service Health, Azure Advisor, which are all ways to help you to improve how Azure is set up. And a lot of this is also implemented through the blueprints that I just showed you. And then in the Quick Start Center, because keeping up with Azure is always difficult because there is so much to do and learn, we've got a bunch of different resources here. And here's some additional resources that's not directly within Azure. One that I'll call out in particular is Azure Charts. This is a, there we go. This is a very cool website that was put together by a Microsoft person just on his own. And basically, this walks through all of the different areas of Azure so you can see what resources are related to each other, where the latest updates are, and it takes basically these 17 different places that you could go to learn what's new in Azure and puts it all in one place, and it's visual, so it's very, very helpful. So you can see all of the updates for things in the last 7 days or just across those particular areas. Okay. And here's the latest of the updates that are considered to be higher value. And there's other things up top here where you can look at your stuff based on particular regions. So I want to compare West Europe to, let's say, DoD. And you can see these are the resources that are shared between them. Okay, just as another example. And then up in the About here, you can see a link to Alexi's LinkedIn page. So you can give him a shout out there for creating this. And we've got a couple videos from myself and Dana Epp here to just talk about the Azure Charts, and so you can get familiar with this. So that's the high level general that I wanted to cover. So I'll open it up to questions at this point. So any feedback that you have or questions on anything, feel free to come off mute and let me know.
Hey, Dean, I think you did an amazing presentation. Loved it. I have one, if you could please clarify for us, because blueprints are kind of new. So for those customers who, like us, who have been using policy and applying policy directly to management groups, which, basically avoids subscription owners later to change anything, right? We can have that same
Right.
control. Can you tell us, because blueprints are kind of new, what's the difference? What's the beauty? I see the value add is that you've already packaged everything, for example, into a CAF blueprint, which has all the different policies that we would need. Is that really the big difference? I mean, please tell us, what's the difference between just using policy and management groups versus blueprint?
Sure. Yeah. So it's the management and the reusability of it. So if you're creating the blueprint, and you've already decided yourself what are the policies that you want and how you want them configured. So while I left things somewhat more dynamic in the CAF blueprint, you can actually set them to be fixed value. So instead of you picking what VM SKUs you want, I can predetermine it for you and then save that in my blueprint. Now I can carry that to any other environment. So if I'm for example, an MSP, and I work with a lot of different customers, I've got my standard blueprint that I want to apply for each of my customers that I work with. I've already written that code. I can upload it to Azure, deploy it, boom, they're done. Or even better now, go through Azure Lighthouse, and then it's already out there. I don't have to worry about one click, two click, everything to get them deployed. And did I set all the settings properly? So the ease of management, reusability of it is where the blueprints are different from assigning policies or initiatives directly.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, do the blueprints get into Office 365 at all, or are they unique to Azure?
So I'm going to say sort of. So there is some stuff related to, actually, I'm going to sort of take that back halfway. So with Office 365, if you're setting up something like a express route with your Active Directory, you've still got resources you have to deploy and manage. So that could be done through a blueprint. But once you've got the full Office 365 side of the management that you're concerned with, everything's already set up and communicating, then no, there's no more use of blueprints to manage Office 365 directly.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Dean, a great presentation. Would like to find out how we can try it out with our internal subscription. Is there a way to do it, or do we have to go through a personal subscription?
So the blueprints themselves are available in every Azure subscription worldwide. So you can go in there and take a look at any one of the blueprints that are there and deploy them. One of the nice things about deploying the foundation is, or policies in general, is that they're non-destructive. So if I deployed a policy that said only resources in East US 2 are allowed, nothing else is allowed anywhere in the world, but we've already got stuff in West US and Japan, the policies are going to show that those things are not compliant, but they're not going to be turned off and they're not going to be destroyed. So it is one of those things that I think is a safe thing to do. But obviously, if you don't want to do this in a production environment, if you're unfamiliar with what it's going to do for you. So having another subscription to test them out in, or another environment, would be certainly a recommendation.
No question. Can we apply Blueprint against resource groups level?
Yes. So the blueprints, if I go back, let's see, where's I get rid of this. So I could take, and it all depends on how you write the blueprint, but if I start out with a blank one here, just call it anything, and I'll put it over here. There we go. And so now I've got a blank blueprint. So I want to say, let's deploy a resource group, and I'll call this just whatever. And I'll fix my particular location there, and just call that whatever. And I'll add a tag of cost, and we'll make that whatever. And now I want to deploy something here. So now I'll deploy a Azure policy. So right now, this blueprint would deploy a resource group and assign this policy to it that would enforce my naming convention against VMs.
Now, what about an existing resource group?
So with existing resource groups, yes, this will work because Azure is idempotent, but I would have to make sure that the resource group name here matches an existing name.
Okay, I see. Cool, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions?
Thanks, Dean. Thank you very much. Any other questions, folks? Last time.
Hey, I have one question on the subscription management piece. You know, there are limits to the subscriptions that an Azure has, right? And you know, for a large enterprise, you know, might end up having many subscriptions. So, what kind of guidance we have when it comes to, you know, the higher level, like, you know, when to create management groups and when to have different subs and how to manage them?
Sure, that's a excellent question. There is somewhat of a philosophical divide within people in Azure on how to handle this. So my basic recommendation to customers of any size is that from a purely Azure technical level, there is no reason why you can't have one subscription for everything. However, there are subscription limits, as you mentioned, and if you're going to run into those limits, then you obviously need more than one subscription. It is also generally a good practice to have a separate subscription for your prod environment versus your dev or test or whatever your other environments are, just so that you don't have unintended consequences. Now, this again assumes a lot of things in how you manage the cloud, but if you have good management practices, good governance practices, good deployment DevOps practices, then you don't have people directly deploying resources to begin with. You do that through service principles and through pipelines, but not everyone is that mature yet. The other side of it is you get people who look at Azure and say, well, every different application should be another subscription, and every different environment should be another subscription, and every business unit should be another subscription. So you end up with, like some of the customers that I've had, with 80 to 90 subscriptions, when they're only doing that so that they can divide the cost. You can do all of that within a single subscription and just use tagging to figure out your cost, or use resource groups as your boundary between business units or applications or environments. So I'm very much on the side of fewer subscriptions, but I do recognize that more than one is definitely good, but I'd limit it to prod and whatever else you have, dev, test, prod, that kind of thing. And then all of those things managed through your management group hierarchy. So we have to have a root group, and then underneath that, you can divide your business units or environments or geographies, however you're managing your company, through different management groups, and then these subscriptions underneath those. So one that I saw that was pretty intelligent was we had different divisions of our company across the US, across Europe, and across Asia. So that was 3 subscriptions, but then they all needed a prod and a dev. So that became 6 subscriptions. And that was okay because they already had the plan in place. So Azure can do any of it, but I find that the fewer the better, because fewer subscriptions means less management overhead.
Hey, Dean, I have another question.
Sure.
So if a customer is already kind of halfway through or 1/4 way through, then can we implement this? And also another question is, do we have a workshop to deliver to the clients?
So yeah, the governance piece, the foundation that I walked through, that can be deployed at any customer, greenfield or brownfield, for lack of a better way to say it. Yeah, so that can be deployed anywhere. And like I said, it's also non-destructive. So if somebody is already in violation of every policy that we deployed, it's not going to hurt them. They're just going to show as non-compliant in the policy center, and then they can remediate those particular resources. So as far as a workshop to deliver it, no, I'm not aware of anything like that. But just for your own future reference and seeing what all these do, I've got a video here on the blueprints, working with blueprints as code, if you want to get into that. And this video in particular, the CAF blueprints, walks through in detail actually deploying the foundation and the migration landing zone. So I would say start there.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, what is that video on the manage 80 subscriptions? What's the like quick high level on that?
So that's basically something I was doing to get ready for Ignite. I gave 6 or 7 different presentations at Ignite this year, and one of them, or actually 3 of them, involved deploying these blueprints into environments. So I had to have 80 subscriptions that I spun up and then set up with the foundation blueprint so that we could have our guests there deploying migration landing zones. So the 80 subscriptions is you watching me use PowerShell and blueprints to deploy across all 80 subscriptions and set them up in a few minutes.
Thank you. I'll check that one out. Thank you.
And
Sure.
another question on data governance is this included inside this blueprints, or do we have to have different policies? We have.
Data governance in what way?
Yeah, storing the data in a database and also on a VM and VM encryption on a server, etc.
So something like VM encryption, note that's not in the blueprint currently, but there is a policy for that, so you could just add that to the blueprint. I didn't originally add that because there are some folks who don't want to use Azure VM encryption because that uses our particular encryption service on top of BitLocker. They have their own encryption methodology, and Azure is encrypted at rest by default, so that wasn't something that I originally included. But that's something that we can definitely explore adding because I'm working on V2 revisions of both of these blueprints now.
Yeah, and also like encryption at rest and encryption in transition, right?
Yeah, so encryption in transit for storage accounts is here, and encryption at rest is by default in all of Azure.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you for staying over, man, and addressing those questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime.
Folks, thank you. And I will post the recording to our YouTube channel. And once again, thank you everyone for joining. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Dean, for presenting. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Naveed. Appreciate it.
Thank you.